Hello, grade 11. It's me again, and it's time for us to study American literature. You remember that last week we finished American Romanticism. And it's time for us now to start American Realism. But before we start, I want you to think about these two terms: Romanticism and Realism. What might be the important difference between these two when it comes to literature? Indeed, in Romanticism, writers tend to show life better, more beautiful, more colorful than sometimes it is, while in realism, writers usually tend to show life as it is, without any adornments or beautification. Okay? So, now, the time we're going to talk about is approximately from 1855 to, again, approximately 1900. Even though if you read more samples of American literature, you will see that American realism actually did not finish in 1900. No way. It still goes on even today, and even some modern writers keep writing in the style similar to the one which was practiced by writers in the time of American realism in the 19th century. Now, another thing for us to know and remember that while reading American realistic literature, we will be studying units 3 and 4 because they cover different eras and different types of American realism. And now, before we start dealing with these types in detail, I would like to offer you the general introduction into American realism. Here we are.
We've all heard the phrase "get real" at one time or another, usually when someone thinks we're being childish or living in a fantasy land. In American literature, the realist movement expresses a similar idea. Popular from around 1865 to 1900, realism challenged readers to look past myths, assumptions, social norms, and other expectations in order to see the world as it really is. To depict the world in this way, realist writers turned away from grandiose subject matter and instead focused on the lower and middle classes, depicting daily life in gritty and sometimes unpleasant detail. The assumption behind this strategy was that literature had the power to change society, and that by depicting life, warts and all, writers could improve the world without being too preachy about it. Historically, this effort to depict the world in honest, objective terms found its roots in the invention of photography and the proliferation of newspapers throughout the United States. Whereas painting made it fairly easy to romanticize subjects like war, photography offered stark depictions of its subject matter. And as the number of newspapers in America grew from around 700 in 1830 to over 5,000 in 1870, writers like Mark Twain and William Dean Howells adapted the tenets of journalism to fiction. Yet while Howells offered a fairly straightforward definition of the movement, by noting that realism is nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of material, not all realists agreed on the best way to treat material truthfully. Authors like Mark Twain tended to practice a brand of realism known as regionalism. In the notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, for example, Twain uses dialect and the local flavor of the American West to highlight social and cultural differences between the story's narrator and the rambling Simon Wheeler. By way of contrast, authors like Charlotte Perkins Gilman found truth and reality in the thoughts and emotions of their characters. This trend is especially evident in The Yellow Wallpaper, which traces a young mother's descent into madness as she struggles with what today's readers might recognize as postpartum depression. Ultimately, however, what all realist authors had in common was an interest in truth and a belief that by honestly depicting the gritty details of everyday life, good writing could change the world.
So, American realism. Again, we are not talking about American realism as something like big, and this big is divided into smaller parts, and actually to understand this whole big thing better, we need to understand different parts. And the biggest parts of American realism can be literature of the Civil War. We will talk about it while reading Unit 3 in your books. And also regionalism and naturalism, of which we will read from Unit 4. And along all these narratives, stories, and documents that we're going to read, of course, we will be meeting poetry, because poetry was a part of every substream of American realistic literature. Okay, so, and for poetry we will have special classes, so we will not talk about poetic rhythm and rhyme at the moment or the next class, even though your Unit 3 starts with poetic texts. We will keep them for later. Okay, now we're not going to talk about literature of Civil War, regionalism and naturalism in one and the same class. Of course not. We're going to divide them, and we will study them exactly in this order, from Civil War to regionalism and to naturalism. And for us today, obviously, it's time to start with Civil War literature. Now, of all human actions, none speaks so dramatically nor so violently as war. Of all wars, civil war, by its very nature, divides a nation's voice into factions. Among the diverse literary voices heard during the Civil War, some of the most powerful were African American. That's why the first thing for us to talk in our series of lessons on Civil War literature will be slave narratives. And also personal experience was central to the literature of that time, because everyday life now had great historical significance. Writers like male and female, white and black, from the height-ranking general down to the common foot soldier, all of them shared their Civil War in diaries, letters, and even presidential speeches. We will talk about those as well. And also later, mostly after the war, the fiction was created by writers such as Ambrose Bierce and Stephen Crane, and this fiction shows the period of Civil War much harsher than romantic writers tend to show war. Their stories focus on the human tragedy of war that destroyed hundreds of thousands of American lives, even as it freed many more. So, you see, behind any victory, behind any war, no matter how romantic it looks in movies or in books, there are millions of lives, thousands of lives, millions of lives lost, millions of people dead. So, and again, obviously, we cannot talk about slave narratives and personal documents and realistic fiction in one class or even in two classes. So, this week, we are only going to talk about slave narratives. And what is slave narrative exactly? To give you a better example, I will ask you to open your books on page 536, and there you see this guy, Frederick Douglass. So, I guess his name says nothing to you, and most likely you've never even heard about anyone called Frederick Douglass, or maybe you read some of his works if you took SAT exams before, because very often the parts of his book, his main book, narrative of his life, come up in the SAT exams, especially for history and literature. Okay, but for the moment, Frederick Douglass. we're not going to read his story right now. You're going to read it as part of your homework. As for here and now, I'm just going to show you a quick introduction into Frederick Douglass and his work.
He was one of the most revered Americans of the 19th century. His story of personal triumph, humble origins to national prominence, is equal to or greater than that of Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, or Ulysses Grant. He never became a politician, but he spoke to presidents as an equal. His name is Frederick Douglass. Born a slave, Douglass never knew the exact date of his birth, never knew his father, never saw his mother after the age of 7. This wasn't uncommon at the time. Slave owners often made a point of separating families. Breaking family bonds increased dependence on the slave owner. Discipline was maintained through simple fear and destroying self-esteem. A slave could be punished for not working hard enough, but also for working too hard, or even for suggesting labor-saving ideas. Douglass experienced all of this and rebelled against it. As a teenager, he taught himself to read. This created a desire for freedom. When his owner discovered this disturbing development, he sent him to live with a local farmer, Edward Covey, who made extra money breaking the will of unruly slaves. Covey beat Douglass every week for 6 months, often for no reason. And it worked. Soon young Frederick gave up all hope of being free. "The dark night of slavery closed in upon me," he later wrote. That all changed one hot August day in 1835. When Covey struck him, Douglass fought back. Where he found the courage, he couldn't say. The two men struggled until Covey stumbled away, exhausted. Covey never laid a hand on Douglass again. The teenage slave had stood up for himself. He considered this the most important lesson of his life. Years later, he would tell this story when urging black men to enlist in the Union Army to fight the Confederacy. "You owe it to yourself," he said. "You will stand more erect and be less liable to insult. You will be defending your own liberty, honor, manhood, and self-respect." Douglass made his escape from slavery in 1838, slipping into the North disguised as a U.S. Navy sailor. At any point along the rail journey, his flimsy cover could have been blown. Displaying a confidence he didn't actually feel, he bluffed his way past suspicious conductors and runaway slave hunters. Once in the North, he joined the radical abolitionist movement and was quickly recognized as a powerful speaker and writer. The movement's leader, William Lloyd Garrison, burned the Constitution at his July 4th speeches. In Garrison's view, it legally protected slavery and was therefore irredeemable. But Douglass came to reject that. He believed that the Constitution was fundamentally opposed to slavery. Interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, Douglass said, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. Not surprisingly, Douglass was a strong supporter of the Republican Party, the new anti-slavery party, and of the Union cause in the Civil War. Initially, he had his doubts about Abraham Lincoln. He didn't think Lincoln was truly committed to ending slavery. But he warmed up to the great emancipator as the conflict wore on. Lincoln, on the other hand, always admired Douglass. "Here comes my friend Douglass," Lincoln said when he saw him at his second inaugural in 1865. The Union victory ended slavery, but as the Democratic Party reestablished itself in the South in the 1870s and 80s, a new kind of racial oppression arose in the form of Jim Crow laws and, even worse, widespread lynching. This was a bitter pill for Douglass to swallow, but he never gave up the struggle and spent the last 3 decades of his life agitating for civil rights. Freedom, he was fond of saying, depended on 3 boxes: the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. For Douglass, it was self-evident that black Americans, as citizens, were entitled to full freedom and full legal protection. At a speech in 1893, when white hecklers began booing him, Douglass set his speech aside and spoke extemporaneously. "There is no Negro problem," he roared. "The problem is whether the American people have honesty enough, loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough to live up to their own Constitution." He also believed that true liberty would only come for black Americans, as it comes for anyone, when they took full responsibility for their own fate. Ultimately, hard work and education would secure blacks the rights they deserved. There can be no independence without a large share of self-dependence. This virtue cannot be bestowed. It must be developed from within, he declared in his most popular lecture, appropriately titled Self-Made Men. Douglass defended equality and freedom until the day he died. Literally. He passed away in 1895 on his way to a political convention. He had well understood the deep prejudice that existed, but he never accepted it as an inherent part of American culture. My cause, he wrote, was and is that of the black man, not because he is black, but because he is a man.
Yes, so this is the introduction in Life of Frederick Douglass, the text that you're going to read at home as your homework. Okay, so now you will read this text on pages 536 to 549. There are questions on page 548, and you are to answer them in your notebooks. And don't forget that the parts of these texts are often included in SAT exam if you are still thinking of taking any SAT exams. And also, reading these texts is very important for our tomorrow's class, because tomorrow we are going to watch some fragments, some parts of a movie based on a book written in the 20th century. It's like a modern novel, but this modern novel is about the time of American slavery, of like pre-war conditions of American slaves. And what we're going to do, we're going to compare Frederick Douglass's account, Frederick Douglass's writing about his life, and the fragments of that movie. Okay, we will compare them. We will see if the movie shows shows the life of American slaves as good as Frederick Douglass depicts it in his writing. Okay, so it's obvious that without reading this text, it will be difficult for you to compare. So please read it at home, and tomorrow be ready to watch something completely different and compare these two things. Okay, thank you and see you tomorrow.